Ladies and gentlemen, thanks a lot for joining us in this side event. As the world moves towards climate neutrality, fossil fuel and also international trade in fossil fuels will decline. Our purpose today is to discuss how alternative emerging fuels such as hydrogen and other synthetic fuels derived from hydrogen can play a role to replace fossil fuels and what this will mean for global energy trade. Obviously, the prospects of a new family of synthetic fuels in the context of global energy transition depend on global and also on national circumstances. And we are happy to have experts today with us that can bring about these national perspectives. Climate measurements are sending us year after year alarming messages concerning the consistent change in average temperatures and the associated phenomena such as extreme events and heat waves. We are all fully aware of it, and the UNFCCC parties have committed to take the steps, probably not ambitious enough, to cope with this problem. It's by now common wisdom that this energy transition has to take place along a twofold technology substitution pattern. On the one hand, electricity as the most efficient and versatile energy form has to gain a much more important role within the final energy mix in terms of energy consumption and use in household, services, industry, and transport. On the other hand, the decarbonization trend of the power generation mix has to lead to a fully sustainable electricity as soon as possible based on renewable energy sources. This double transition path is on its way, with two important, however, technological pitfalls that have to be resolved. One of it is related to the flexibility and energy storage in the power generation sector, with a view of sector coupling and load flattening, etc. The second pitfall is related to the difficult electrification in some transportation modes and high temperature industrial processes. In that context, green hydrogen and other hydrogenated fuels are likely to play a vital role, adding flexibility and covering an important gap in the transition. Although as pure electricity storage, there could be other technological options with a better cost-benefit ratio. Factoring the high thermal density of these fuels can unleash a crucial and unique opportunity, mostly in transport and industrial sectors. So to discuss these opportunities, we have today an excellent group of specialists. In the first place, Mr. Augustijn van Hasteren from the European Commission, DG, will present the initiatives taking the European Union to pave the way for these opportunities to materialize. My colleague, Paul Dolin, will discuss later the role of hydrogenated fuels in the context of emerging new energy trade patterns, progressively replacing fossil fuels in international energy flows. Dr. Shai Jimin, Director of Strategy and Planning in China's NCSC, will provide us with a Chinese perspective on hydrogen use, and hydrogen trade. Then Mrs. Manal Shehabi, who's Senior Research Fellow in the Oxford Institute for Energy Studies, will discuss the energy trade scenarios in the Gulf region. And to conclude, the nascent regulatory issues related to hydrogen networks will be addressed by Dr. Dennis Hesseling from the Agency for the Cooperation of Energy Regulators, ACER, and Dr. Claudio Marcantonini from the Italian regulator agency, ARERA. So that's from my side. We have foreseen slots of about 10 minutes, as indicated in the agenda. For the good order of the discussion, I would kindly ask the speakers to stick to them in order to leave some time for the discussion later. And without any further ado, I would now like to give the floor to Mr. Van Hasteren for the Commission. Over to you, Augustijn.
Thank you, Antonio, and many thanks for the opportunity to speak to you today. This will be an interesting day at the Energy Day at the EU Pavillion, and if you like this session, I can only recommend you to look to the other ones as well. Today, I understand will also be the launch of the Global Energy and Climate Outlook. This is already since quite a few years a benchmark also for us in the policy setting area as to, let's say, how successful or unsuccessful we are in our achievements to achieve the climate goals. And the report I understand today is the energy trade in decarbonized world, very pertinent for reasons I will elaborate on later on. So I was asked to give you a bit of an overview as to what is happening at the EU side. So evidently, when it comes to hydrogen, it is as yet today a rather immature and underdeveloped market. But on the policy side, many initiatives are ongoing to change this perspective. And this, I think, first push came from the climate agenda, which the current Commission has really put high on the agenda for 2050. Net zero by 2050 means a significant change in the energy mix, electrification, energy efficiency was already emphasized by Antonio, but also still a remaining role for gases, with this difference that the gas demand will be met with a very different composition of gases than we know today, and hydrogen will play an important role. 2020, we launched a hydrogen strategy, realizing this, how we're going to put this in place, and the Repower EU communication, which is the EU's response to the, let's say, the Ukraine-Russia war and how we deal with our energy issues in the future, is only reinforcing this. Yes, there's a lot of emphasis for the need to replace Russian gas, but I think those which have read the communication knows that the answer is primarily also doing faster what we intended to do anyway, namely to replace gas. And if you look at the overall picture, that means that by 2030, we would like to produce within the EU 10 million tons of gas, but also import. And I think this is also where the newly GECO report will be very interesting, because if we have imports, it means that we also have to look at the international market for hydrogen and derivatives, and any debate in that context is a very useful contribution to the policy setting debate. So what does the EU do? I think one of the most important aspects of the is that we are trying to set a framework for a liquid and competitive market. That has two components. Definitely the demand side. We want to provide certainty as to what the demand side will look like in the future. And in July last year, we proposed a set of measures which together set a framework for the launch of demand by 2030 along the targets that I just referred to. So it is Renewables Directive, Energy Efficiency, ETS, Energy Declaration Directive, all kinds of incentivization measures. But we also at the and that ambition, because that was before the outbreak of the war, set out has been increased in the Repower EU, where communication, we have asked the Parliament and the Council to increase the ambition to 75% for industry by 2030 and 5% for transportation. So demand requires a market if it wants to be met efficiently. So we have also in December last year proposed a package to the Council and the Parliament in order to set up a liquid and competitive market. And so this is an amendment to the gas regulatory framework, where we now also include hydrogen. However, there is a clear recognition that hydrogen is, yes, a gas, but a very different gas than natural gas, and it also requires a specific approach, which both take account of the flexibility needed to build up an immature market, but also, even if we use general concepts from the gas market, needs to be adapted to the realities of hydrogen. I understand there will be still a few words on this part later on. So if we want to have a hydrogen value chain, we also need to support the industry. That means that there are initiatives on the way to set up a let's say, under the keywords of Hydrogen Alliance and IPCIs, to set up, to organize the industry and to, let's say, to line up a let's say, a line of investments to which would be components of that value chain. This is more, let's say, setting up investable projects, pipeline. And of course, it needs financing, because we now are in a situation where renewable hydrogen is not yet fully competitive with the alternatives. So I'm not going to mention all the financing fronts which are available, but they are quite extensive. This is both true for projects which are located within the EU, where both on the EU level, i.e. the Innovation Fund or the Resilience and Recovery Plans, significant amounts of money are available for this transition element, including hydrogen, but also on the national level. And I just mentioned that under the Global Gateway instrument and the Neighborhood instrument, there are also money available for non-EU member states. So when we talk about stimulating trade, and we are also putting a focus on making sure that partner countries can invest in those kind of value chains. So it's nice to have demand, it's nice to have a market rules, it's nice to have support for building production chains, but it's also nice to be able to transport hydrogen and derivatives. So I already mentioned that we're setting up a market framework for hydrogen in particular, not derivatives, but in particular hydrogen, which means that the rules as to investment in infrastructure are clear, and that those who want to put their money there have investor certainty. But we also, more practical terms, we are building a pipeline of projects under the TEN-E regulation, which was revised and adopted last year, and which allows the development of energy infrastructure and financing it, and in particular also hydrogen. So that on one hand focuses on pipeline-related projects, which will be primarily based on repurposed infrastructure, with 3 hydrogen priority corridors, North Sea, North Africa, and as soon as possible, the Ukraine, but also import terminals. And that includes both hydrogen as well as other types of terminals. So it's not just the gaseous imports which are being treated from the infrastructure point of view. Last but not least, so it's quite clear that especially if we want to accelerate the development of a hydrogen value chain and reply to the REPowerEU targets, we need to have import. I mentioned already the 10 million tons which the EU would like to import by 2030. And that means that having realized that, we have to work also on the national framework with like-minded partners on the development of sustainable supply chain for renewable hydrogen and derivatives. That includes, of course, let's say the actual delivery, but also facilitation of research and development and commercialization of innovative technologies and infrastructure. With like-minded, we mean those which are interested in a global rules-based market of hydrogen-based solutions, including harmonized safety and environmental standards. And an important element there will be certification, also standard setting and exchange on good regulatory practices. So this is true, of course, in common interest. We would look forward to collaborate with other like-minded importing countries, but also, of course, with those countries which would like to export hydrogen and derivatives to the EU. One of the elements which will be emphasized there is that, of course, renewable hydrogen requires electricity production, and we would like to see, like we will in the EU, certain similar rules on certification, i.e. also the need to extend the production of electricity, renewable electricity, on the moment you produce and deliver renewable hydrogen inside, but also outside the EU. And at the moment we are working on with potential suppliers, with MOUs which are in the process of being signed with, for instance, and I apologize if I forget some, Morocco, Namibia, Egypt, Kazakhstan, and also we're working on this kind of arrangements with Ukraine. As I said, as soon as we can, we would like to work also with Ukraine. That is a very quick and high-level overview as to what is happening, but I think in terms of the time devoted, this is the kind of detail I am able to give to you at this moment in time.
It was excellent. Thank you very much, Augustine, for this concise but complete overview on the European policy on hydrogen. Now we give the floor to Mr. Dolling, that will illustrate the findings on the issue to be presented in the forthcoming GECO 2022. Over to you, Paul.
Thank you, Antonio. Let's wait to see if my slides come up. There they are. So next slide, please. Firstly, a quick word on the GECO series. Every year, the JRC releases its Global Energy and Climate Outlook, which gives projections of energy and emissions under different scenarios. And each year takes a special focus. For example, in GECO 2020, we focused on the impacts of COVID and on the energy system and emissions. And in 2021, we looked at the impact of nationally determined contributions and long-term strategies. The GECO, as Agustin said, is an important input into European Commission policy discussions and is based on the partial equilibrium global energy model POLS and the general equilibrium model GEMI3 that covers the interactions between the global economy, the energy system, and the environment. GECO 2022 presents energy and emission results for a reference scenario, our NDC LTS scenario, and a 1.5 degree scenario, and also features detailed analysis on the energy embodied in the trade of goods. And in addition, this year we focused on the role of energy trade, as I said, and we've taken a deep dive into the trade of hydrogen and e-fuels. Next slide, please. So looking at the headline results, that of the energy mix and emissions, and focusing as I will through this presentation on the 1.5 degree scenario, we see that the energy mix transforms from one that is dominated today by fossil fuels to one that is dominated in 2050 by renewables. And this leads to an emission reduction of over 80% between today and 2050, as we can see in the graph on the right. So whilst progress is far short of what's required to limit temperatures to the Paris Agreement levels, there has been some policy action in major regions and continued cost reductions and deployments of low emission technologies in the past year, which has seen the temperature increase reach 3 degrees by the end of the century in this year's reference scenario. It was closer to 3.2 degrees in last year's report. So there has been progress, but not enough. Next slide, please. With the focus of this year's GECO on trade, we see in the 1.5 degree scenario that the trade in fossil fuels decreases sharply over the coming decades as the world decarbonizes. Trade in renewables and low emission fuels increases, led by the trade of modern biomass, which is, for example, wood pellets, with hydrogen and e-fuel trade only a very small share of the direct trade of energy in 2050. Also, the share of total demand that is met by traded energy decreases as the combination of more renewables being built in countries and electrification leads to less demand for imported fuels. And this leads to a global increase in energy self-sufficiency. So important to note that throughout this presentation, hydrogen refers to hydrogen used both as an energy fuel and for non-energy uses, such as feedstocks for ammonia production. And production of e-fuels in our modeling are both gaseous and liquid electrofuels, where first hydrogen is made, then electricity is used to convert that hydrogen to a hydrocarbon by the processes of methanation and Fischer-Tropsch. Next slide, please. Turning to the role of hydrogen and e-fuels in final energy consumption, we see that they have an important but relatively minor role to play. We see in the graph on the left that in a 1.5 degree scenario, electricity is the major fuel, followed by biomass, and even oil consumption plays a larger role than both hydrogen and e-fuels. The graph on the right shows that hydrogen and e-fuel growth accelerating towards 2050, with hydrogen reaching 9% of total final consumption and e-fuels 2% in 2050. So for context, in the reference scenario, which we're not showing on this graph, but we have the results of, we see that as hydrogen production costs decline as a result of existing policy support in a few countries and regions, hydrogen does play a minor role in the reference scenario and reaches 3% of total final consumption in 2050. But e-fuels, in the absence of existing policy, do not enter the energy mix at all due to their high cost. Next slide, please. Moving now in the presentation to take a deep dive into the results of the new analysis on hydrogen and e-fuels. First, we'll look at demand, then supply, and then finally the trade of these fuels. The global demand for hydrogen we see in our 1.5 degrees scenario is concentrated in the largest regions of China, India, and the United States, after which the bulk of countries and regions account for only a very small share of global demand of hydrogen, 1 or 2% by 2050. Next slide. Where is that hydrogen used? Well, we see it mostly being used in transport, both used directly in hydrogen fuel cell vehicles and as an input to the production of e-fuels that are also used as transport fuels in road, aviation, and maritime sectors. A relatively minor share goes to steelmaking, and decreasing volumes go to non-energy use as we move towards 2050, primarily as the demand from the refinery sector decreases as oil demand decreases in the 1.5 degree scenario. Next slide, please. Green hydrogen rightly receives a lot of focus as it reaches half of total global production in 2050. With limited CCS deployment and green hydrogen still relatively expensive in the midterm, our modelling sees nuclear-based hydrogen production playing an important role, reaching 1/3 of total global production by 2050. Nuclear-based hydrogen production also sees countries with more limited renewables resources having a route to low-emission domestic hydrogen production, which, as we'll see in the next slide, domestic hydrogen production is important. Finally, on this slide, we see that blue hydrogen, which is made from fossil fuels fitted with CCS, accounts for 15% of total production in 2050. Next slide, please. And the final element of the supply story is, where does the hydrogen e-fuels come from? And here we see a very clear picture. The bulk of hydrogen demand is met by domestic production, and of the small share that is traded, most arrives via pipeline. Our modelling shows that the cost penalty for shipping being too large to cover the cost benefit of production in better resource locations. There is a nuance here, which is that is definitely the picture by 2050. However, by 2030, there is a larger share of total production coming from imports. So imports increasingly, as you reach 2050, play a smaller share of supply. That picture is somewhat relaxed for e-fuels. As transport costs for e-fuels are much lower than for hydrogen, it becomes more economically viable to produce e-fuels in the best locations and ship them to the point of demand, resulting in 1/4 of e-fuel demand being met by imports in 2050. Next slide, please. So to wrap up, some of the main findings of GECO 22 are that as the world decarbonizes, a larger share of energy is produced domestically, and the direct trade of energy decreases. Hydrogen and e-fuels play an important but minor role. Renewables and electrification is still the main focus in a 1.5 degree world, and most hydrogen is produced domestically. And then finally, just to mention that GECO 22 will be available soon at this link, so please check back in the coming weeks. Thank you very much, and back to you, Antonio.
Thank you very much, Paul. That was very concise also, and very sticking to the timing. Next intervention is from Dr. Shai Min from NCSC, that will provide us with the Chinese view on this important issue. Shai, the floor is yours. You're muted, please. Shai, you're muted.
Thanks, Antonio. It's a great pleasure actually for me to share some points of view from our side about future hydrogen use and trade. Next slide, please. As we know, China have announced our carbon neutrality targets before 2060. And to achieve such kind of decarbonization pathways, we, of course, should use lots of novel technologies, which will reduce both the carbon dioxide and also the non-CO2 greenhouse gas emissions. Among which, of course, the switching the fuels from like the fossil fuels to the low carbon and green hydrogen, the methane, and also biomass is also very important here in China for our future developments. Next slide, please. So we can see lots of decarbonization technology is required as a clean and sustainable secondary energy. Hydrogen energy actually is very important here to achieve for example, the transportation and also chemistry industries, how they can achieve deep carbonization in the coming stage. Next slide, please. And also we do lots of multi-model comparisons, and we can see currently about 85% hydrogen actually is used actually in the industrial the feedstocks. For example, the petrochemistries and other industries here in China. But when we modeling the future pathways, we can see there's will be growing actually amounts of hydrogen use for energy and also other uses as well, typically for the next 15 years, which is very important stage here for China to boost the hydrogen infrastructures. Next slide, please. China now is the largest hydrogen producer all over the world. As we know, China produced over like 33 million tons of hydrogen annually since 2020, about 1/3 of the world's total productions. And also in our scenarios, we can see by 2035, there will be 5 to 45 million tons of hydrogen will be used in China. And also for the year 2050, the number will increase to 42 to 179 million tons of tons. And also for the year 2060, which is the milestone for China to achieve our carbon neutrality, such a number will increase to 57 to 250 million tons. Now in our planning making, so such kind of future projections also consider for the decision maker for future developments. Next slide, please. And in the March 23 this year, China has launched our national plan for hydrogen energy industrial development to 2035. We can see we sent lots of numbers. For example, for the hydrogen vehicles, the fossil fuel, the fuel cell hydrogen vehicles, and also the refining stations for hydrogen. Now we already have over 200 here in China, almost half of the world total. And also we set targets for the year 2030 as well. As we know, our non-fossil fuel share will be achieved around 25 by that time. And also we will increase the share of green hydrogen by that time. And also to the 2035, the hydrogen will actually aiming to accounting a very important share here in China, typically for the industries and also transportations as well. And well estimate the infrastructure for the next 5 years constructions. Next slide, please. And also we are starting for design hydrogen market mechanism here in China between different regions. As we know, in the northwest of China, there's lots of renewables. For example, the hydro, and also the solar PV and the wind. So the East Coast, they consume lots of fossil fuels now, and in the coming future, it will be switched to for example, the green hydrogen in the future. And also, we are aiming to have international collaborations with other countries, mainly on for example, the technology innovations and the common standards, and also the infrastructures, the supply chains for the green hydrogens, and also lots of MOU have already signed in our Belt and Road initiative, and together with lots of developing countries, and also the EU is invited as the third party to working together. Next slide. So to wrap up, China is now also working on green hydrogen development in the future, and it definitely will contribute a lot here in China for the steel and chemistry industries, and also for transportation. It's also a big potential for us to foster older industries feasibility for the future. So I stop here. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Ai. Now we will get the other Asian perspective from Dr. Manal Shehabi, that will give us the perspective from the Gulf production and trade perspectives for hydrogen and hydrogenated fuels. Over to you, Manal.
Thank you very much. And hello to everyone. I'm delighted to be here with you today, and also to give you the perspective of Gulf economies, and thank you for the kind introduction. I do have some slides to share with you. So what I really want to just talk really is more from the perspective of the Gulf Cooperation Council in the region, because as we know, the Middle East region is quite big. So focusing mostly on the countries that are currently leading, the wealthy economies that are leading in fossil fuel trade. So in terms of starting with the positioning or the drive of the energy transition in the region, really this came from the expectations that obviously now we have different expectations, but and outlook, but the outlook that was really dominant until about last year or even beginning of this year of how fossil fuel trade and demand will go globally, and that if we were to actually meet the 1.05 Celsius scenario or target, then the demand for oil and gas will largely decline. And as you know, Gulf states really depend for the majority of their economies, both in exports, but also government budget on exports of fossil fuel. So that really, despite having for many years economic diversification plans, it was really this outlook for an alarming decline of fossil fuel revenue that really triggered the move and incorporation of energy transitions in the Gulf. And these states do have these big, large visions of economic diversification. They need also to meet the needs of growing populations, and they are welfare-based economies, but also they've adopted really large-scale utility scale renewable project, and also in the UAE there's also been a nuclear power plant that's been established, and there's requirements, so to speak, from a fiscal perspective to really also meet these large energy transition projects. Last year, what was a bit different and slightly maybe the main move for Gulf states is last year Saudi Arabia and Qatar joined the Net Zero Producers Forum along with the US, Canada, and Norway. And then right before COP26, so about a year from a year like now last year, the United Arab Emirates announced net zero pledges by 2050, and Saudi Arabia and Bahrain by 2060. And that was really kind of the change, so to speak, of the plans at a larger scale for Gulf countries to join energy transition projects domestically, but also in the export system. If we go to the next slide, please. One of the main advantage that the region has is it has some of the world's best renewable energy sources, which also means that they have some of the lower costs of producing renewable electricity. And if we can go to the next slide as well, we'll see that this is also the case with wind. They have very good wind sources. So that, if we can go to the next slide, please, then we can see how this is really kind of really the impetus to try to also generate a lot of the renewable or energy transition projects. Of course, for hydrogen, because hydrogen, as you all know, can be produced from fossil fuels, but also renewable energy, this had set the Gulf states at a potential comparative advantage to produce hydrogen. And in fact, the region had adopted some very large-scale renewable energy projects announced, really, but also renewable and hydrogen projects and ambitions, but also at the moment, the most of the production, as globally, most of the production that's from hydrogen comes from the dirty, so to speak, so from fossil fuels without any incorporation of carbon capture and sequestration technology. But this is where the Gulf states are focusing most of their hydrogen projects. There is very little, in my opinion, focus at the moment that's announced for using this hydrogen domestically, although there are some plans in Oman and in Saudi Arabia, but most of it is really for the international market. If we can go to the next slide, please, then we can see here basically what will be driving cost of hydrogen, which will obviously drive some of the trade for it. As you know, for green hydrogen, it's mostly renewable energy cost, which in the Gulf has been really low, and then electrolyzers cost, which varies. And we've done some work, my colleague and I, on looking at the cost of producing green hydrogen from the Gulf without looking at transportation cost or storage. And the Gulf does seem to come very advantageous with a potential comparative advantage there. When it comes to blue has already been a focus also for the Gulf region because of its existing fossil fuel infrastructure and low cost production, gas particularly, but the CCUS technology is still very behind. So if these technologies then ramp up, then the region is expecting to also ramp up its trade for hydrogen on the blue hydrogen front. If we can finally go to the next slide, we can see that even though the Gulf state had positioned itself that they want to really be leading in exporting hydrogen, both blue and green, at the moment, this slide is from Irina, at the moment that actual projects are quite behind in the region compared to other countries in the world, but also compared to where the demand is expected to be. This is kind of just on the give you kind of the background and the perspective of the plans. If we can go to the next slide, I'd like to take you now through a little bit more on what this means then for trade. So basically, I want to highlight a few points to bring to your attention. First point is that the fact that from the perspective of Gulf countries, fossil fuels will continue to be part of the energy, future energy trade from that they will be exporting. And this is particularly important because this could be in, even though in the GECO outlook, there is still obviously trade for fossil fuels, but for the Gulf states, this is really a very important part of their future energy mix. And there's been very little demand on what they, or not demand, outlook or expectations on what they will be, the composition or the share of fossil fuels versus other, such as hydrogen or e-fuels. But in terms of, if we look at their international, their nationally determined contributions that they've submitted to the UNFCCC, I'm quoting here the first bullet point, which is straight from the Saudi submissions, what basically highlights that there will be always fossil fuels as part of the diversification plans. But the key thing here is a big focus on technology for CCUS. So the idea is to continue to produce fossil fuels as fossil fuels and exporting them, but also using what has been announced as the circular carbon economy framework, which is a large framework to kind of have different technologies to reduce or store the carbon emissions. So this is really going to be the important bit from their perspective. And also, even though while COVID was happening and the fiscal constraint that happened post-COVID, we've seen upstream investments for oil and gas go down. Since the invasion of Russia of Ukraine, we have seen that actually this had reversed. So we have really large expected about over approximately $840 billion worth of underway investments in upstream oil and gas. And this is obviously driven by the rise of oil prices this year. And if we look at some of the new IEA expectations from the World Energy Outlook, we see that under different scenarios, fossil fuels will continue to be part of the trade from oil and gas. And even if we meet the 1.50 scenario, and that goes significantly down, you'll see that the expansion or the size of the hydrogen trade vis-a-vis in the announced pledges scenario is actually not significantly more. So what this picture is telling us is even if we have less fossil fuel trade, it's not necessarily going to translate to higher hydrogen or other, for example, derivatives such as, synthetic fuels or ammonia trade. So this is the first point to kind of remember from the perspective of the Gulf states. You can go please to the next slide. The second part that I want to bring to your attention is even though the size of the hydrogen market is, as we've heard from the GECO outlook, it's not as large as had been previously predicted, and even demand goes anywhere from 12 to 22% of global energy demand, which varies depending on the assumptions and the actual projects. The Gulf states could potentially have a large side of that if the technology and the renewable energy infrastructure is committed. And I've done some calculations on this. If we have approximately anywhere from $400 to $700 billion worth of hydrogen and derivatives products, that's the size of the market, the Gulf states could have anywhere from 70 to 200 billion share of that. So that could be large, but again, it depends on the actual plans that will actually materialize in terms of projects. On the next slide, you'll see that there's also the graph. We can go, there we go, thank you. So in terms of the direction of trade, one important thing to show on the direction of hydrogen, it will be very similar in many ways, the direction of current fossil fuel trade. And what I mean by that is if we look, because I've mentioned a little bit the fact that, there's very low cost gas and also existing hydrocarbon infrastructure, but also there's real serious water constraints in the region. And also there's lack of pipeline transport options from the region. So what that means is there's a natural favoring of blue hydrogen, and to be using that in shipped ammonia and liquefied hydrogen or other derivatives rather than just basically hydrogen. And in fact, there has been already from 2020, the first shipment of blue ammonia from Saudi Aramco to Japan. And if we look at the current bilateral trade agreements and MOUs, these are just the main announced ones. We see that blue hydrogen now is going from the Saudi Arabia, from Oman and from the UAE to Korea and Japan, but also Qatar is looking to invest in this as well. In terms of the green hydrogen plans, these will be most likely trying to target the trade towards Europe and less so towards Asia. On the next slide, you'll see just an example of some of the large-sized projects. I won't go through the details, but just to give you an idea that there are committed really large projects that are intended to be completed between 2035 and 2038 in Oman for green hydrogen, NEOM in Saudi Arabia also green, but then also Saudi Arabia have large committed blue hydrogen projects. Go to the next slide. I want to highlight now one of the, despite these large projects, one of the key takeaways when it comes to the trade from Gulf states is that we do not yet have the infrastructure that is required to produce and trade the green hydrogen that is being promised. I won't go through the details of the slide. I'll summarize it very briefly. Gulf states, with the exception of the United Arab Emirates, so we're looking at Bahrain, Kuwait, Qatar, Oman, and Saudi Arabia. They have targets for renewable energy anywhere from 15 to 50% of the capacity installed for electricity. But at the moment, the average is less than 1% only. So it doesn't even meet the local market requirements or demand. The UAE is standing at 12% or last year by 2021, and that's because of the expansion of the Baraka renewable, the nuclear power plant. And this is very much behind the other countries in the region. If you go to the next slide, on the final point to keep in mind for the Gulf states is that even though they do also have these large focus on blue hydrogen trade, currently the technology infrastructure is also not available and currently not viable. So, and you'll see this is also from the numbers of who's really investing in technology front. It's obviously mostly Europe, and the budgets on hydrogen and low carbon energy R&D. The Gulf states sits in the green little shares of these graphs, which is the rest of the world, which is around average of 1%. So very little investments on this front. And this is why a lot of the investments currently are being driven with private partnerships with private companies, or for example, other large scale like the US and UAE partnership on clean energy technologies. And finally, just to conclude, the main point here to take away for the Gulf exporter economies is that the fossil fuel component of their energy trade will continue to be prevalent. The key thing that they are promising is to have the carbon CCUS technology to reduce the carbon content of that, but also expand the green hydrogen and blue hydrogen trade. Now, this depends on, of course, having markets and having uptakers and the funding and balancing exports and local needs to decarbonize also the local energy supply chain and infrastructure. But at the moment, despite these large targets, I think the actual demand and supply at this very moment remains to be a little bit uncertain. And thank you very much for the time and for your attention to this.
Thank you very much, Manal. This opens a lot of questions for the debate. I hope we have time to address them about the competitive advantage for this crucial part of the world in order to produce green hydrogen in the future. So now let's move to the regulatory aspects of the deploying infrastructure of hydrogen and hydrogenated fuels. I give the floor now to Mr. Denis Hesseling from the Acer and Claudio Marcantonini from ARERA. Over to you.
Thank you very much, Antonio. And indeed, I will start and Claudio will take over in the second half of our presentation. What we will present here actually complements to quite some extent what Augustijn van Haastrecht spoke about when he presented the legal framework for hydrogen in Europe. And also when Paul Doling spoke about the potential uses for hydrogen and how hydrogen could be transported from supply centers to demand centers. What we'll focus on, if I have the next slide, please, is the regulatory aspects as we see them, and maybe a few words about the role of regulators in this particular interpretation. When we speak about network regulation, this is about economic regulation of a monopoly segment. So pipelines carrying a gas from A to B. There's normally one in the region. It needs to be regulated to make sure that all parties can use it in a non-discriminatory way. And that's the role of regulators in a very, very brief nutshell. So it's there to set rules to enable competition between other parties who can produce or buy or trade the hydrogen to take off despite, let's say, a network segment of the economy, and also to make sure that consumers of hydrogen are protected. We cooperate indeed at European level in two ways. One is the formal EU agency, which I represent, Acer, and then the CER, which is the, let's say, a bit more informal Council of European Energy Regulators. Can I have the next slide, please? So when you speak about regulating the hydrogen sector, this is challenging and different from what we have seen in the past. Our reference point here is mainly regulation of natural gas and electricity in Europe. What is quite different here is that hydrogen still needs to establish itself as a mature sector. We have some hydrogen, we have some pipelines in Europe, but it's quite limited, it's unregulated at the moment. And this still needs to develop. And there's quite some uncertainties about how it will evolve, and I'll speak to that in a moment. We come from a world where we had already, by and large, energy systems in place, whether it's electricity or natural gas, and that needed to be regulated. The focus there was on market integration, make sure we create a European market rather than all the separate national markets, and on efficiency, making sure that the money that's invested is spent in an efficient way, that we don't over or under invest. On top of that now, of course, we have the whole decarbonization agenda, which presents new challenges for regulators to make sure we incentivize the right developments which are efficient, not just in the economic sense, but also towards decarbonization targets. And we don't know what the optimal energy mix will be, and it probably will be different from member state to member state. And so what needs to happen, on the one hand, we need to make sure that the key regulatory principles are specified at an early stage. And that's what the Commission is doing with this proposal, to make sure that anybody who wants to invest in the European hydrogen sector knows already beforehand what in the end the regulatory system will look like. On the other hand, we want to avoid over-regulating too early. If you set too specific rules too early in the process, it would stifle innovation and it would make investments more difficult rather than easier. And so in the early stages, we have to be careful not to over-regulate. Now, to make it more concrete, let's move to the next slide. Let's look at where hydrogen could play a role in the future decarbonized energy system. This is a slide we took from what is called the Energy Transition Commission. So it's not our own thinking. This is from a group of energy companies who plotted different end uses on two axes. And one is the horizontal one, where they say, how confident are we that hydrogen in the future will play a role in this sector? To the right is very confident, to the left is not so confident. And on the vertical axis, they plotted how ready are these sectors to use hydrogen already now. On the top is high and on the bottom is low. And so if you combine those two, you see sectors like refining, for instance, the small one. There's a high confidence, yes, hydrogen will play a role. It's playing a role already now. And yes, it's ready to accept hydrogen. That is an easy case. On the lower part, but still at high confidence, are sectors like aviation or shipping or steel, where these energy companies think we're quite convinced hydrogen will play a role there, but they're not ready yet. It will take more time. And these are bigger bubbles. It means there's more volumes which should go there. But then if you move to the left part, so there's less confidence. Heating, for instance, is in there. There's quite some debate about the role hydrogen could play in heating. For low temperature, it's not certain at all. That would be an efficient way. Probably electrification will play a bigger role. And so probably not so much investment should go in that way. Now, this has implications for the role of pipelines and to transport hydrogen and the role of regulation there. Let's move to the next slide. And this is what you see here. You see two completely divergent visions of what a future European hydrogen pipeline might look like. On the left-hand side, you see the vision of the gas TSOs, transmission system operators, of what they call a hydrogen backbone. This looks quite similar to the European natural gas pipeline system we have nowadays, and it's really a way to make sure that hydrogen in the future can be transported through pipelines basically across Europe. That's one vision. To the right, you see a very different vision. This comes from Agora Energiewende. It's an NGO, a German NGO focused on energy transition. And they did a consultancy study to see where are the no-regret options for hydrogen pipelines. They focus on industrial demand, where they see for sure the need for hydrogen, for green hydrogen, and then they connect those. And so you get different regional clusters where you need pipelines, but they don't see a need for a fully developed European pipeline system for hydrogen. Now, we don't know which one of the two is right, and it's not our role actually as regulators to decide that. But this, of course, means there is a lot of uncertainty at this stage about what the future hydrogen network system would look like. And that means as regulators, we have to be very careful to, on the one hand, set the right principles, but also be flexible and allow the sector to develop in the most efficient way, taking into account the decarbonization targets. I'll hand over to my colleague, Claudio Marcantonini, and he will take over from here to speak more about the specifics of this hydrogen regulation.
Thanks, Danny. Thanks, Antonio, for the invitation. I will now describe in more details the proposal of ACER and CR on the regulation of hydrogen. Next slide, please. As Danny already mentioned, the key approach is to have a gradual regulation. This means that regulation of hydrogen should follow the evolvement of the hydrogen sectors, both in terms of infrastructure and also in terms of market structure. And this, in order to, on one side, give certainty to investors that the system will be regulated, but also to allow for flexibility, because as Danny explained, there are still uncertainty, and also there may be different speed on member state to the development of the hydrogen sectors. The gradual regulation requires periodic monitoring of the sectors. Those monitoring should be done also by the regulators and by also other institutions like the Commission in particular. And this monitoring is to assess the system itself and to develop, to decide when there is need more action. In particular, this monitoring has to look at the competition, which is a key aspect of regulation. So avoid that there is a market power of players in the market. Other important point is that the regulation has to be gradual, but has to be based on the key regulatory principle, which we already have a lot of experience on the regulation of gas and electricity sectors. In particular, the fact that there is a supervision by a regulatory authority, the third-party access and non-discrimination means that the infrastructure should be open to all players. Transparency in the use of this infrastructure, on the cost of this infrastructure, protection of consumers, in particular of household, and unbundling. I mean, separation between the part open to competition and the part instead which are monopoly. Those key principles should be there from the beginning. The way and the strength they are applied should be done gradually. Finally, it can also important to have exemption for specific case, in particular already existing network or like a small network, whereas business-to-business case where probably, especially in the initial phase, there is no need of a strong regulation. Next slide, please. I will now move on the infrastructure aspect. First of all, an important aspect is the one of repurposing, so switching from gas to hydrogen, using the actual gas infrastructure, revamping them and using for hydrogen. That's an important aspect because it can save a lot of money, because it's cheaper to revamp to repurposing gas infrastructure than building a new hydrogen. So it's important to take into account, but it's always looking at the cost-benefit analysis. So all investment should be done looking at the balance between the cost and benefit, taking into account all the aspects, also of course the social value and the avoided cost. Second point is who's gonna pay those infrastructure, in particular the new one. And here the key role of the key aspect of regulation is the reflectivity. This means avoid the infrastructure should be paid by those who benefit. So those who have use them and benefit for them. So it's important to avoid cross-subsidization between different vectors, because it's mostly inefficient and also inequitable. And it's better in this case if there is a problem of financing to use instruments like general taxation or, for example, the revenue from the UTS. Next slide, please. On the planning infrastructure, it's important to have also here a no-regret approach, as also was mentioned by Dennis. So looking at the most efficient solution, and also the integrated approach in terms of vertical and horizontal integration. Vertical in terms of distribution and transmission, so all the value chain of the infrastructure transport, and horizontal in terms of different vector, electricity, gas, and hydrogen, because the planning on one side will have effect on the other side. Next slides, please. Finally, on consumer protection, so all consumers should be protected regardless of the energy carrier. It's important they are informed of the costs. The costs should be distributed equally among them, and it's important that those costs should be efficient, share fairly, and equitable, and also, if needed, for vulnerable consumers to have financial support, because the transition will have a cost, and those costs eventually will be paid by consumers. Next slide, please. Those are the two papers by ACER and CR, where you can find more details on the proposal of the regulators on the regulation of the hydrogen sectors. Thanks.
Thank you very much, Claudio, for this interesting vision on the regulatory needs that are coming for a market that is deploying and is behind the corner. It's a pity that we didn't have any room for questions. There were a couple of requests in the chat. But this is all. I mean, we have had a lot of information squeezed in a short time of period. So I would like to thank you all for your contributions and for your insights. And we leave this as an issue that we have to reflect upon, because we certainly, if not the silver bullet that will solve the transition to the global energy transition, at least a key element to be taken into the consideration. We see that on the one hand, e-fuels entails an increase in self-supply, and globally it would improve the energy independence and security of supply. On the other hand, some countries will be benefited dramatically by their very low levelized cost of electricity, as Manuel's presentation indicated. So we need to see up to what extent this phenomenon will contribute to redeployment of industrial activities in the global economy, and find robust projections to anticipate which is the scenario that will eventually prevail. So with this, I would like to thank you all again for your contributions and for your reflections, and we will see in different forums like this probably in the future. Over to you, and thank you very much for your contribution. Goodbye.